Well, welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal or Anglican priest, and I am in long-term recovery. And the point of these podcasts is to go deeper into the psychology, the history, and the spirituality that underlie the 12 steps. So I did want to announce before we get going that we finally finished the video on two-way prayer. I had been doing Zoom workshops for 2 or 3 years on that, and the material was just getting very old for me. It was like hard to get the energy up to go do it another time. So we put it on a video. I'd love to have you go to our two-way prayer website, review it, and we will make some edits in about 2 or 3 months. So if you have any critiques, I would love to hear from you on that. You can write me at twowayprayer@gmail.com. We have, excuse me, as our guest, Dr. Ian McCabe, who is a psychologist, a Jungian analyst, has an advanced degree in addictions, and has been a student of 12-step recovery over the years. And so he brings a great deal to the table. And we have been going kind of slowly through his book. The book is called Carl Jung and Alcoholics Anonymous, The 12 Steps as a Spiritual Journey of Individuation. And I'm glad we're going slowly because I think there's a lot of important material, basic material in here that I'm excited to have a Jungian analyst with us who can take us deeper in appreciation of some of the stuff that those of us who are in recovery have been dealing with and bantering about. And now we're going to look at it a little more analytically. So that's the the background to this series. In the last episode, we looked at Bill Wilson in his growing up, or perhaps his lack thereof, as he was hit by trauma after trauma in his life. And it may have been laying the seeds for addiction. He didn't drink till later in life. I think he was 21 or so when he took his first drink, but he was instantly taken to a new place inside. And I'm convinced that those of us who have undergone trauma in our earlier life, boy, something is going to then register with us that takes us to that place. And for Bill, it was alcohol. For others, it may be drugs, sex, or rock and roll, whatever it might be. But it is that something that then takes us into addiction. So welcome back, Ian. I hope you're having fun with this.
Thank you indeed. Good to see you, Bill.
Good to see you again. What I want to do in this episode is shift a little bit to an important point that I hope we can get a deeper appreciation and understanding of, and that is spiritual experience. What is the nature of spiritual experience? How does this come about? What's going on psychologically and spiritually when this happens? And of course, the big one, the granddaddy of all spiritual experiences that people in 12-step recognize is Bill's encounter at Towns Hospital, where something really shifted inside of him. And I'm going to read the quote. This is taken from, it's a little different than the one probably most people have heard before, but this is from Bill Wilson's autobiography. He recorded it into a tape recorder a number of years ago, but it's the closest thing we have to an autobiography. And here's what he says about this. And this will kind of get us going. He says, "The terrifying darkness had become complete. In agony of spirit, I again thought of the cancer of alcoholism, which had now consumed me in mind and spirit, and soon the body. But what of the great physician? For a brief moment, I suppose, the last trace of my obstinacy was crushed out as the abyss yawned. I remembered saying to myself, I'll do anything, anything at all. If there be a great physician, I'll call on him. Then with neither faith nor hope, I cried out, if there be a God, let him show himself. The effect was instant, electric. Suddenly, my room blazed with an incredibly white light. I was seized with an ecstasy beyond description. I have no words for this. Every joy I had known was pale by comparison. The light, the ecstasy, I was conscious of nothing else for a time. Then, seen in the mind's eye, there was a mountain. I stood on its summit where a great wind blew, a wind not of air but of spirit. In great clean strength it blew right through me. Then came the blazing thought, you are a free man. I know not at all how long I remained in this state, but finally the light and the ecstasy subsided. I again saw the wall of my room. As I became more quiet, a great peace stole over me, and this was accompanied by a sensation difficult to describe. I became acutely conscious of a presence which seemed like a veritable sea of living spirit. I lay on the shores of a new world. What the hell was going on there, Ian?
That's so beautifully read, Bill, and so beautiful words, prose. I'd have to just reflect for a moment to absorb just how beautiful that writing is and what's going on. So we can take it because we understand recovery, how important it was. But just imagine Bill had gone down the road to a Fifth Avenue modern day psychiatrist and looked at that and said, well, here we have images appearing, hallucinations, not voices. I think we'll sign this guy up for 3 months in Rikers Island if he's got no money, or a plush place, and we'll label him as schizophrenic and give him some pills, and that'll be the end of it. And there is now a group in California Institute of Integral Studies that had an understanding of, they call it spiritual emergencies, whereby people who might be designated as psychotic were able to get comfort and be helped to understand what was happening to them. So on the line of what happened to Bill, again, the scientific psychiatrist might say, well, he was taking a lot of belladonna and a mixture of other drugs, and this is what sparked the hallucination. I would argue that even if you were taking LSD and he had this image and this experience, that it remained with him and transformed him. And so no matter what caused it, it is very, very helpful.
It's not unlike the mystics in that regard, Ian, am I correct? Where they have experiences that are most unusual, but they all say, just as you've said, don't focus so much on the particulars of the experience, but on the fruits of it, what came of it. And what came of it for Wilson was a change, a psychic change of some sort. Am I right?
Absolutely. And it was of the instant kind, what William James calls, for many people in the 12-step program, if they work the steps, having had a spiritual awakening by the time they get to the 12th step. Now, they may not realize they've actually had a spiritual awakening, but Their transformation will be that they'll be able to self-reflect on the wrongs they've done and admit the wrongs they've done. Whereas if they hadn't had a spiritual awakening, it would always be, oh, I'm in the right, you're in the wrong. That's a simple version of what I would see as spiritual awakening that I meet with people who have had a spiritual awakening. Now, their spiritual awakening was what's called of the gradual educational sort, step by step, the confession, the righting the wrongs in steps 8 and 9. But what Bill had was something almost miraculous. It's as though in his desperation, he knelt down and he said, if there be a God, let him show himself. Maybe he also said herself, who knows? He was very advanced, was our Bill. But the God image, I would say, is part of the great self within us all, that if it's appealed to in desperation, may give us some guidance. In this case, it gave him very obvious guidance, and it will help a person to get in touch with their true self and help them to unite their ego back with the true self and build a relationship with it. So this great experience, where did it come from? I've encountered several people who've had similar experiences. Carl Jung also writes about these extraordinary experiences that manifest themselves from within, but appear on the externally on the outside. Some scientists might call it kinesthetic energy, whereby pots and pans in a household can suddenly start rattling, and we could see something in that. But just sticking with the idea of this true self talking to the person. First time I experienced it was when I was in Berkeley at going to one of my classes on addiction studies. And there was a guy flipping hamburgers, and he asked me where I was going. I said, I'm going to a class on addiction studies. And he stopped and he started talking to me. He said, you know, I used to be heavily into cocaine, and I was lying on the couch one day, and suddenly I heard a voice that said, get up off that couch. Doesn't sound very divine, but he said, I was startled. I listened. I got up off the couch and I said, go out, get a job. And it wasn't his mother talking to him. He seemed a little bit taken aback and a bit frightened by the voice, but he ended up getting off.
But he knew the voice was not his normal thinking ego voice. It had a quality about it that was different.
It was a voice from outside. He said it was definitely outside of himself, and he obeyed that voice. He obeyed that voice. Mm-hmm. That made me think about it. Then I met a guy who I refer to in my book, who was very, very desperate and had a gun cabinet and went down to his gun cabinet all set for the next morning to shoot himself. And as it happened, he couldn't lift his legs out of the bed. He couldn't lift his legs out of the bed. He had prepared the gun. He had brought his daughter back to his ex-wife. He'd gone to bed with the intention of shooting himself in the morning. And again, he heard a voice telling him no, and his legs wouldn't move. And he was inspired then to stop drinking and joined AA, and didn't have a drink. The last time I met him hadn't had a drink for 20 years. So these voices from outside, maybe in times gone by when we talked about vocations, vocari, the call, the people did hear voices and took them as being fairly normal. I'm very concerned that when a person does tell a psychiatrist that they hear a voice, that it is one of the symptoms of schizophrenia. And there are two instances. One guy came in to me who is a heroin addict, and he said, he hears voices occasionally, and I'm going, yeah, I'm listening, okay. And he asked me, what do you think? And I said, well, these voices could be the God image, the self, guiding you, trying to reconnect you. away from heroin, which is damaging you and may kill you, and the true self, your inner self, wants you to survive. And it could be guiding voices. And he said to me, I'm glad you said that. I said, oh, really? Good, good. He said, yeah, because some time back I went to see a psychiatrist, and he told me I was schizophrenic. And I said, no, okay, I don't think so, no. He said, good. I said, how did you feel? As the question we always ask, how did you feel when he told you were schizophrenic? He said, truthfully, straight face, he said, I knew where his car was, and I had a knife, and I went out and slashed all his tires. And I went, okay, okay, it's definitely you're not schizophrenic. So another instance was, and this is quite tragic. I was at a lecture, and a psychiatrist had said that she was trying to identify children who would have schizophrenic tendencies. And I'm working with children. Children tell me that, oh, their friend is said this. And I said, well, can you let me talk to your friend and identify with the friend in their head? And she was saying that these instances of children who were hearing voices were indicative of future schizophrenia. I was astonished by this. And now, admittedly, she did say at the end that there was instances she came across in time of war when a child might hear a voice to be quiet, Nazi occupation, children in a cellar, and a voice would say, be quiet. And where would it come from? It would be a protective voice. So where do the voices come from? They always seem to be helpful, guiding voices. My own belief in is, it is the true self, the greater self, the higher self, talking to the ego and saying, look, you're not making a good job of this. I'm going to just slip in here. I shouldn't really do this because you're supposed to be independent, but I'm going to just give you a little bit of guidance because you're really going down the wrong road here. I'm going to help. And the true self to me is all-encompassing part of the being that includes the ego. And I see it as, I see the ocean, and then I see a drop can come out of the ocean, and that's the ego. But the ocean itself is the greater self, and the ego is connected to the great ocean, the great self. And this would bring us into what Carl Jung says, the collective unconscious, and the what he calls within us all, there's a 5 million year old man or woman who has got a great knowledge, has been involved in all sorts of situations, and has got solutions that we can tap into. So we're not just born, we're born with a mind that is connected to our ancestors that goes back millions of years, and we have got this collective unconscious knowledge within us and that we can draw on. And sometimes it comes out in desperate times, especially.
And that makes perfect sense if you equate it with the physical evolution that goes on in the body, that at stages of development, we look like a fish. You know, we have gills. Yes. It's you can almost track the evolution going on. And why would it not be that this also happens in the human mind? Absolutely. That there's an evolutionary piece to the puzzle, and we participate in that. But the ego, Ian, thinks that little drop of water thinks it's the ocean. Is that the problem?
Yes, that's the problem. Particularly with alcohol, inflates the ego and ignores the self. And the self is saying, time to come home, time to start thinking about your mortality and spirituality. And the ego is obsessed with materialism and wants a bigger and better car or a new trophy wife, etc., and is reluctant to surrender that which it has put in so much energy into. But yeah, so the ego begins to think it's the king and no longer the ambassador, and that the self can be ignored at its peril. I always say, though, that God never gives up. God never actually gives up, even though in AA it says, you know, there are no hopeless cases except for people who are constitutionally incapable of change. But I would actually say that God seems to never, ever give up. I think obviously of the case of cited of the person swimming in the ocean, and God sends a boat and then sends a helicopter, and the person just ignores them all and then says to God, okay, I drowned. Why didn't you help me personally? He said, well, I sent you the helicopter, I sent you the boat. What more did you want? Okay. So I think in everyday life, God doesn't give up on the person who is very actively involved in their addictions, whether it's a combination of alcohol and gambling and sex and shopping or whatever. I say to the wives, and it is a case of the wives generally, don't you worry too much about your partner. God is good. God will trip them up. And lo and behold, God does do something to give them a chance to reflect. And sometimes it can be as straightforward as falling on their face and being in hospital for a few weeks. But so I suppose that's why the desperation of continuing to drink gets harder and harder, because it's so in opposition to the self, to the true self, to uniting with the true self, that really wants the ego to start becoming spiritual and recognize that its place is as a partner in this relationship with the true self and not in a dominant position.
And the realization of this connection, insight, if you will, into who I am, that I'm not this being who should be laying in the gutter. I'm not this being who should be abused the way I am. It comes as a shock sometimes, and so that there's a breakthrough that happens, and it's very powerful. There's a lot of energy when the self manifests, the greater self manifests like this. The ego is put in its place, not condemned, but rightly related in terms of, you are my source.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
and then you have to begin that process. I think one of the things I really liked about the Bill W. book was wherein he, from his perspective, sees spiritual experience coming about, and he lists four, and the big one is the one that we've been talking about, the town's hospital. I think of it kind of like when you watch a fireworks display, you know, at the end they just shoot them all off. And that was sort of the great white light, hot flash one that we all are aware of in 12-step recovery, but he lists others. Now, some might be legitimate, some might not, but I'd like to go through them and see what your take is on them.
And before you do that, Bill, if I could just interrupt you and say, the similarity of the experience he has in Town's Hospital, I'm just entirely from memory now, but it's as though the white light came in through the window, from the window, and that there was energy coming in from outside. But Carl Jung writes about a case where he writes, where I'm looking at my book now, page 29, a patient who had progressive paralysis and wanted to kill himself. Just as he was about to jump from the windowsill, a tremendous light appeared in front of the window, hurling him back into the room. That I relate to Bill's experience, that this light came in through the room. And now a more visceral one would be a second case. In this case, he calls it a psychopath. He was so sickened by his life and he decided to kill himself by inhaling gas. So he suddenly felt an enormous hand grasp him by the chest and throw him to the floor, where he gradually recovered from his fright. The hallucination was so distinct that the next day he could still show me the place where the 5 fingers had grabbed him. So one presumes that an energy used his own hand to push him back. And this is the power that comes from the outside. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. I think we need to drill this home before we look at some of the minor ones, because it's extremely important. I had an experience, mine was auditory. I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I'm 27 years old. My life is going to hell because of alcohol. I'm studying to be a Jesuit priest. I'm at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, and supposed to be helping the chaplain there. And I am dragging gallons of wine back to my room and getting drunk and in trouble. And inside, the ego thoughts were saying, go to Australia and stay drunk for the rest of your life. Just do this. And the other thought inside of me, also ego, was saying, go to India and join an ashram and get super holy. And it was then that I heard a voice, and it was distinct from my usual thinking voice. And it said, and I'll never forget the words, I never forget where I was. It said, Bill, you are 27. If those are your choices, there's something wrong with you. And it was the collapse of the ego system that had been fighting things, and always, if I just try harder. No, trying harder is not going to get you there. The path is, what's wrong with this situation? And that, began my recovery. That was my last drink. And I didn't have the language for it, Ian. I didn't have the understanding. But as I look back on it, yes, this ego that had been fighting everything and everyone now collapsed. And I went back to the people who had tried to help me with some humility this time, saying, I don't know what to do. Help me. And that was everything. That was everything. So that was the beginning.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think seek and you shall find, ask and you shall be answered in the biblical, I may not be quoting it correctly, is correct. Yeah. The other point I would make is that maybe hearing auditory voices externally is not as rare as we think. When I get together with a group of therapists, could be 12 therapists, and I introduce this concept of external guidance from the true self, even though they would be very skeptical, maybe 2 or 3 would actually say, oh, I had such an experience when I was in hospital, or I had a child or birth, and then they will talk about the experience, and it may lead into, oh, at this particular time, something was happening at the other side of the world with my son or my daughter, and these synchronicities, as well as the voices, as though the collective unconscious is able to connect up and manifest whatever is needed to be heard at the time. So maybe they're not as peculiar, but people have learned to keep quiet about them, to associate them with the local mental hospital. And I have to say, if some of my assistants came to me and said, we're hearing voices, I would have an ethical responsibility to delve into it very, very deeply, because if they were working with clients on my behalf, I would have to be very, very careful. Whereas, so where I'm saying I'm very open to hearing people who hear voices, at the same time, there is the scientific explanation that would have to be understood as well. But overall, particularly with people in addiction, the voice that they hear, if it's rare, is of a very helpful nature and trying to guide the ego. I would say, put it like a parent lets a child run in the park and pretends, okay, you're free to do whatever you like, you're 4 or 5, just run around, and the parent keeps an active eye on them. But then when they see the child at the edge of the cliff or the water, they go over and go, okay, maybe it'd be better off if we went back a little bit. So that is the guiding force of the self protecting the ego.
Many times I hear patients speak about suicidal thoughts. And Robert Johnson, Jungian analyst, writes about this. And he says, well, you're kind of on the right track, but you want to kill the wrong self.
Right.
But so intuitively, we kind of know there's something wrong inside of me. And it's fight or flight, and so the wanting to kill the self oftentimes comes up for those of us who are addicts, but Johnson really helped me when he said, this happens in his patients, but he says it's the wrong self you're trying to kill.
Mm-hmm.
It's the inflated ego.
Mm-hmm.
That you want to escape from,
mm-hmm.
And like you're saying in these examples, but if I kill the body, I'm going to kill the true self as well. So the self kind of comes through and says, wait a minute, Charlie, we're in this thing together,
Yeah. Just this example comes to mind. If you let a 5-year-old child drive the car and suddenly they go, let's crash it. No, I'm with you. No, don't. So the true self is protecting itself. And I absolutely believe that I've heard so many people talk about the synchronistic coincidences that happen when they're about to kill themselves. It's just incredible that I really do believe there's divine intervention. I'll give you an example. The year 2000, I was having a New Year's Eve party at my home in Ireland. It may have been because nobody invited me to a New Year's Eve party, or else I wanted to have a non-alcohol, alcohol-free party. But anyways, at 7 o'clock, I'm ringing up people. We didn't have a phone file fax then, but I'm ringing up through my diary. And I come across a name of a client who is, I know him to be very isolated and lonely. So I think, I'll ring him to wish him a happy new year. So I ring him. I go, okay, Johnny, just Ian here, just want to ring you, say happy new year to you, and I hope everything goes well for you. And he gasps and he said, can we meet? And I go, oh, Jesus, it's New Year's Eve, I'm holding a party. I go, Johnny, I'm really busy this evening. I said, no, I really need to meet you. So I go, okay. I think Eddie Rockets is open, and we meet. We go down to local village and we meet. And he sits there and he tells me, I had just got a knife in my hand when you rang, and nobody ever rings for me. My mother answered the phone and she said, there's someone on the phone for you. And he said, nobody ever rings me, nobody. And I went down, but I left the knife behind. And he said, I had that knife because I was about to go into the front room to stab my brother. And I went, right, okay. And I'm still thinking about the party, and I'm going, well, if you go home now, what are you going to do? He said, oh no. He said, this has been a revelation, an interruption. I go, okay. And I'm still looking at the clock, but I spend enough time with him to reassure him that no need to kill the brother and to make an appointment to come in and see me the following Monday. But I can't help but think that that was some sort of a divine intervention to protect himself through the collective unconscious. But I digress very much because we're talking about Bill's insights and particularly, I think when you refer to, we could look at also his experience in Winchester Cathedral.
Yeah, we'll tick through them. So the first one that he mentions in the book is he's going off to war. All right, he's a young man. He's there with Lois. They're on the beach off Newport, Rhode Island. And he writes this: "The sun was just setting, and as the minutes passed, our gloom was superseded by a growing feeling of duty and patriotism. And we talked about those things. And then it turned into an elation that I now realize amounted to a genuine spiritual experience. In other words, we found exaltation in the joy of sacrifice. We were given the strength and the joy to go on in the face of utter perilousness over the circumstances. That was the first outline and trace of the spiritual experience mechanism as it evolved in me over the years. I shall never forget that experience. It was triumphant." Nature, when the ego is in the presence of profound nature, is there something that happens also to diminish its size, to get it in its right place? That's what I kind of take from that. There are some times when I'm thinking and stuck in my thoughts, and I will go outside and look at the stars, or I will go even look at the clouds, or the connection with nature has a tranquilizing effect, or at least it can, or may have in this instance. What do you think?
I absolutely agree. I mean, you only have to look at the redwoods in the forest of California and stand in front of them and think of their majesty and how long they've been there. And I can't help but instigate in one a reflection that leads to a spiritual connection with the tree. So I'm like a tree hugger, only the redwoods might be too big. But I would like to be devil's advocate on this experience that Bill writes, because it's before the war and before he's going to the war. Now, I would say this is the First World War, which America is going to support Britain.
Right. Yeah.
Equally, had a congressional vote, might have been a couple of hundred years gone ahead, where they were deciding would they have English as the national language in America or German. Had the vote gone ahead and they said, we'll have German as our national language because we have a lot of German immigrants, would Bill have been going over to support Germany in the First World War, which was very different in the Second World War when you had a psychopath like Hitler. But what you had here in the First World War was alliances that combined almost a force of their own to trigger war. And so my skepticism is, yes, there is a spiritual element to going to war, but is it not taken over by advertising people who sort of piggyback on military patriotism, on good people's spirituality, young people's spirituality in particular, and say, now you're joining a great collective with a great cause in humanity. And I'm wondering, hey, could you be tricked here?
Because absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that happened to my son after the World Trade Center was destroyed. You know, he goes and he joins the Marine Corps, you know, and he had this sense of service and calling. I'm older and wiser. Say, wait a minute. But in youth, that's why the generals send young men and women to war, and they tend to stay home. But there is that spirit that even in militarism, of unity, of discipline,
Yes.
that has power.
Yes.
And it can be dangerous power, for sure.
Yes.
This is why you have to have discernment of spirits.
Yes.
Yeah, but he was terrified. I mean, that's the thing I take away from this experience. And he found something beyond himself that was, and I to me it was nature. It
Yes.
was the nature thing. I guess I identified more with the nature than with the militaristic
Okay.
piece, and that's
Yes.
a little safer. Now, the
Yes.
second incident, not
Can
so
I just,
much.
can I just go say
Yeah.
something on that? I remember looking at a father whose son had died in the Iraq invasion, and saying it took him some years later to realize that Saddam Hussein was not responsible for the 9/11. He was an easy scapegoat.
Oh, sure. Sure.
And he's saying, my son, it's painful. My son died in vain. He went on a cause where he was misled. But I digress a little bit. But I would
Same with Vietnam.
Yes.
Same with Vietnam.
And I would hope that the spirit, the true self, would be able to drop a hint to the ego and say, think twice about getting involved in military expeditions.
Absolutely, absolutely. The incident, we won't go into it, but he was on a ship. Then he's going over to England. He's in the Irish Sea, and the ship gets hit, and he assumes command. All right,
Yes.
and he has a feeling, a rush.
Yes.
A rush comes over him, and he
Yes.
feels, I'm not a coward after all.
Yes.
So, but there's a connection. I think you're very right to be very guarded. It's called discernment of spirits. You got to watch these spirits who come and take over. They may be there for good, or they may be there for danger, for evil. Watch out, discern them, discern them. But he did feel that power. The third one.
Oh, sorry. Can I comment?
You want to comment on that?
So,
sure.
Yeah, sure. So Bill is on the ship and it's hit by an explosion.
Right.
He is, as far as I remember, a second lieutenant. So he'd be in charge of a certain number of men, but there would be a captain on the ship as well. And he takes command of his men. Okay.
Right.
In an emergency, we hear of great energy that a person can lift a car off someone in an accident. What Bill did there from a psychological perspective was he grounded himself and the men. He was able to say, I found I had to offer to shoot them to stop it. He grounded them, made them slap on the face almost, and he grounded them to get to their senses. And this would have come from within. It might have come from his training as an officer. And I think it's wonderful. And then he can attribute it to a spiritual energy. And that's fair enough, because I would not be criticizing, nor would I be contradicting anyone who says this was a spiritual experience. So on the first one, being at the sunset, yes, spiritual experience. Many of us had them, looking at the sunset, and we realized there must be something greater than us in the universe. Surviving on a ship that's just been torpedoed, absolutely, one would draw on one's spirit in such a case. So absolutely, I would be going along with them, but I would just add in a little dose of skepticism, because as one of my cousins used to say, don't ever let the truth get in the way of good story. And Bill was known for his stories.
Oh, he loved his stories, right? And he could exaggerate and build them up. Yeah.
But what we're getting to really is that he's having gradual spiritual awakenings, that he's providing the opening to have the grand spiritual experience. So in a way, he's having the gradual educational process of a spiritual awakening. Yes.
Yeah. And neither of those two that we've discussed are in the big book or very well known.
Mm-hmm.
The next one is fairly well known.
Yes.
But let me and I know you had some background with this that I'm really interested to hear. So this is the famous Winchester Cathedral experience. So let me read from his telling of the tale. I walked inside the cathedral. There was within those walls a tremendous sense of presence. Again, it's World War I. He's under fire and he's visiting this cathedral. I remember standing there, and again, the spiritual experience repeated itself. I thought of France. I thought of wounds. I thought of suffering. I thought of death, even of oblivion. And then my mood veered sharply about as the atmosphere of the place began to possess me, and I was lifted up into a sort of ecstasy. Though I was not a conscious believer in God at the time, yet I somehow had a mighty assurance that things were and would be all right. And then it was that I went out and read the inscription about the Hampshire Grenadier, and once more I was possessed with the spirit of adventure and the spiritual experience, and the depression that had preceded it vanished in the background. You went to the cathedral, I understand.
Yes, and for those who are not aware of it, the inscription of the Grenadier, the name of the Grenadier is Tetcher, T-H-E-T-C-H-R. And later on, Bill did acknowledge that he may have been drawn to that particular tombstone because of the name Tetcher. And it is possible that Thatcher in America is a derivative of Tetcher. And what I find very interesting was that he must have written down the doggerel on it, because the doggerel said, you know, here lies a grenadier who drank bad ale, basically, and got poisoned. And that could be a euphemism for drinking too much and getting cirrhosis of the liver. And I'm glad that I was accompanied on that journey down to Winchester Cathedral by my good friend John Hoppin, who happened to be a professional photographer, and took a picture of the tombstone, which is in my book, and also the words come through on the tombstone, and I compared them to what he had written in the big book, and the words are exact. So it must have been a very important experience for him, and this happened around, I presume, around about 1918, and or 19. I think 1918, but 20 years later, 1939, he's including these words in the big book. So we held on to that, what he called a doggerel, for 20 years. And it was very interesting, because Ebby Thatcher was a severe chronic alcoholic. And this, in a way, was a warning to Bill himself that alcohol can kill, even though it's disguised as poison. In this case, he drank bad ale, but it can actually kill. And the Grenadier, there may have been denial at the time and said, let's not say he drank too much. Let's say the ale was poisonous and it killed him. Who knows? But anyway, he's dead because of the ale, drinking bad ale. And this was something that hit home for Bill, obviously, and had a very, very important impact on him.
But again, he references the sense of presence. The ego tends to deny that presence, the inflated ego.
Yes.
Whereas in Jung, I thought of Roland, you know, place yourself in a religious environment. You know, well, a cathedral could be a religious environment. Your mind is drawn up. You become more aware of your smallness, and that allows perhaps for a sense of presence to overtake you.
Yes.
To bring the ego down to right size, you know,
And that's why
Go ahead.
cathedrals are built with the ceilings so high.
Yeah.
And so inspiring, and can take generations to build, when they start off in the 12th century and don't complete it till the 15th century, so that they have a sense of continuity. I think that experience he had.
And they have shadows with the little gargoyles of devils running around. It's Quasimodo. I was attracted very much to Quasimodo as a child. I liked him. My shadow side was very deep, even at 6 and 7 years old. If there's a point I want to make or hope to make from this episode, it's to help people understand that when we say in 12-step, I have to get rid of my ego, I have to kill my ego, edging God out, all of this sort of stuff, be very careful of that. Mm-hmm. We must have an ego. It is absolutely necessary, otherwise I am psychotic, but it must be right-sized.
Yes.
And it must be in relationship to something greater than one's self, or one will create a substitute for that. Am I not right? It will become money, it'll become power, it'll become something. As a Bob Dylan, you got to serve somebody.
Got to serve somebody.
Yeah, who's it going to be?
I think he's got some very good quotes, Bob Dylan. We're talking about a balance. So the ego has a balanced relationship with the self, and the self may allow it to be inflated when it needs to get a career and build a house and borrow money from the bank and support a family, but then to withdraw somewhat from the material world to link up with the self. And that's why I always quote the sort of midlife crisis, or the midlife age at around 40, when a person realizes that they're mortal and that now is the time to start thinking about their mortality, and realize that the satisfaction that the latest model of a new car gives them may not be the same as it would give them when they were 16, 17 or 18. And so I think we're designed to become spiritual beings, and to start reflecting on our mortality. And I do think that when Carl Jung did advise Roland Hazard, spiritus contra spiritum, that to get a spiritual environment or to get a spiritual interest, that it would contradict the alcohol, because the alcoholism was contradicting the true spirit. Let me just rephrase that and say Carl Jung wrote in his letter to Bill Wilson that his advice to Roland Hazard was to get a spiritual experience. And he said very modest, he was very reluctant to say that because he would be criticized by scientists and Freudian analysts for introducing religion into therapy. And in all modesty, he was very, very careful about it. But he did say spiritus contra spiritum, that the spirit of alcohol contradicts the true spirit. But the interesting thing is, he was not the first person to come up with this idea. The Roman emperor, name escapes me just for a moment, Marcus Aurelius.
Marcus Aurelius?
Sorry, say it again.
Aurelius?
Aurelius. He would advise his troops not to be drinking before going into battle, but also to advise them that there are ways to abstain from alcohol by getting into pursuits that were of a more spiritual nature. He may have mentioned reading. So Marcus Aurelius.
Yes.
And so he had come up with this idea 2,000 years ago.
Well, and if you study the Greek mythology, Dionysius, the god of ecstasy, was not the god of drunkenness. Bacchus in the Roman take of that became a corruption.
Mhm.
But Dionysius was ecstasy, connection with, not drunkenness. Drunkenness ruins it.
Yes,
And
yes,
I
yes.
think it's William James, it's the yes factor. There's a part of us that says yes to life. And that's the self, the greater self, that is affirming and leading and prompting. And the sobriety, this is James, shouts no. This is sobriety in the negative, abstinence, just not drinking. No, no, no. And this is the conflict that's going on deep inside of a person. And how do you get it where you are in connection with that which in yourself responds to that energy, that beauty, that to the greater self? And that's why it's everything, the connection. And so we're going to start going through the steps. But what I would like to get very clear as we set off on this journey, next episode, going through the steps, that where we are heading is to step 12.
Yes.
Having had an encounter with this greater self, having had that, then we have a message to carry. You know what I mean? It's not just I'm not drinking, but I've found something.
And the ability to maintain the sobriety is in two ways in relation to the 12th step. First of all, to pass it on and practice these principles in all our affairs, but to pass it on in particular, the old adage, yeah, I spoke to 12 drunks, I didn't get any of them sober, but I remained sober. That's it. But also, I love it when I hear people talking about the 12th step and then refer to constant thought of others. As a therapist, I would say to someone, if you really want to remain as sober and happy, then try to cultivate gratitude when you get up in the morning that your feet are still working and your toes are wiggling. But during the day, think of others as constant thought of others as to what you can do to be of service, because then you're being truly of service to the self, to help others, because now you have that gift of sobriety. Pass it on as best you can.
Because I'm not the only one in connection to the self. So are
Correct.
they.
Correct.
So are they. So are they. Yeah. Wonderful. Good place to wrap it up. Next episode, we're going to start going through the steps. And what I'd like to do is provide Ian with an opportunity to give us a Jungian perspective on what's happening, as he does in the book, with each of the steps as we go through them. So, Ian,
as best I can.
Yeah, I look forward to that, and it's been a pleasure. I think we hit some very important information here that I hope will be of help to all of our listeners. So, thank you guys for listening. God bless, and keep coming back.